Liora Vance had been given exactly one honor in 3 years at the Jade Palace, and she had spent 11 days building it with her own 2 hands. She was 24, apprenticed to the court's senior florist since she was 17, and she was, by any honest measure of the trade, the most gifted hand the palace gardens had trained in a generation. A fact the senior ladies of the court had decided, collectively and without ever quite saying so aloud, was itself the problem. Liora's father had been a hedge cutter in a river village nobody at court could locate on a map. Her mother had died birthing her. She had come to the palace on a groundskeeper's recommendation and a florist's stubborn insistence, and she had climbed, entirely on the strength of what her hands could do with living things, to a position the court ladies felt, with the particular cruelty of people defending a hierarchy they did not build but benefited from, she had not been born entitled to. This year, for the first time, the master florist had stepped back and let Liora build the founding day bouquet alone. The single ceremonial arrangement carried before the throne at the year's most sacred rite. The one honor in the whole calendar that put a florist's work directly into the Dragon Emperor's own hands. She had chosen every stem with a purpose she could have defended to any judge in the empire. White founding lily for the old oaths, river iris for the water that fed 9 provinces, a spray of small gold-throated blooms called ember bell that grew only in the far northern reaches near the old imperial nesting grounds, included because the archive records said the first Dragon Emperor's mother had favored them. And Liora, who read old records the way other apprentices read gossip, thought a founding day bouquet ought to reach all the way back to the founding. She did not know, how could she, that the Dragon Emperor Faelan had watched her build it from the garden colonnade 3 mornings running, in dragon form, unseen, drawn by a scent his own memory had not placed yet, and would not place until the rite itself, when 11 days of careful work would be thrown, in front of the assembled nobility of 9 provinces, into his own sacred fire as a joke. The senior ladies who orchestrated the theft were 3, led by a woman named Odessa Rennick, whose family had held a minor seat at court for 4 generations, and who had never once, in Liora's 3 years of service, addressed her by name rather than by the flat, diminishing girl. Their grievance, dissected honestly, was almost embarrassingly small. Liora's talent had begun, quietly, to be noticed by people whose notice mattered, and a florist's apprentice climbing past the daughters of minor nobility offended a sense of order Odessa Rennick had never had to examine before it was threatened. The founding day honor, a hedge cutter's daughter carrying the ceremonial arrangement before the throne, was, to Odessa's circle, not a triumph of skill. It was an insult to be corrected. They planned it the way court cruelty is always planned, casually, over embroidery, in voices pitched to sound like nothing at all. It would be a jest, Odessa said. A small one. The girls' flowers would simply find their way, in the crush of the procession, into the ceremonial fire pit that burned at the right center. The one flame in the whole palace that no living soul but the emperor, in dragon form, was permitted to approach, sacred to the founding itself, and therefore, Odessa reasoned with the particular logic of the cruel, perfectly safe for the purpose. No one would blame a crowded procession for an accident, and the hedge cutter's daughter would learn, publicly and unforgettably, precisely how much her honor was worth. Liora suspected nothing. She had spent 11 days on the arrangement and the whole of the rite morning on final touches, and she carried it to the procession's staging line with the specific, fierce pride of someone who has built something entirely her own, and is, for one morning, allowed to be seen carrying it. The rite began at midday, in the great open court before the Jade Palace, with every noble house of the empire assembled in their founding day formal dress, and the Dragon Emperor Faelan already present in his ceremonial form. Vast, black-scaled, coiled at the center of the court around the sacred fire pit that burned, unattended and eternal, at the heart of the founding rite. Liora carried the bouquet in the procession's second rank, exactly where protocol placed a florist's apprentice. And it was there, in the crush where the procession narrowed to pass the fire pit's outer stones, that Odessa Rennick's hand found the bouquet's stem, and, with a small practiced twist that looked, to any casual witness, like nothing more than an accidental jostle, sent 11 days of Liora's careful work arcing over the low stone rim and into the sacred flame. The court's reaction was instant and cruel in the specific way of an audience that has been quietly primed to laugh. A ripple of amusement, quickly smothered into court propriety, but not quickly enough. And Odessa's voice, pitched just loud enough to carry, murmuring something about hedge cutters and their flowers not being suited to sacred fire. Liora stood frozen at the rim of the pit, watching 11 days of work catch and curl in flame that no apology could ever retrieve, and felt something in her chest go as still and cold as the stone under her feet. She did not cry. She had learned, over 3 years of exactly this kind of small cruelty, that crying only fed it. She simply stood and watched and absorbed the particular public shape of being told, once again, precisely how much her honor was worth. She did not see the great black head turn toward the fire until the whole court's laughter died at once, all together, like a held breath. Understand what the sacred fire pit meant before I tell you what happened next, because the court's horror in the next several seconds cannot be understood without it. The fire had burned, unbroken, since the founding of the empire 9 centuries past. It was not decoration. It was doctrine. The one flame in 9 provinces that only a dragon emperor, in his own true form, was permitted to approach, because the fire itself was said to burn at a heat that would kill any lesser creature that entered it, dragon emperor included, should he ever be foolish enough to test how much of the old founding magic remained literally true rather than merely ceremonial. No emperor in 9 centuries had ever stepped into that fire. It was watched. It was fed with ceremonial oil twice a year, by attendants using a 12-foot pole specifically designed to avoid proximity. It was, in every practical sense, untouchable, even by the one creature doctrine claimed could touch it. Faelan turned his great head toward the flame, and the whole court, watching, understood in the same instant what he was considering, and the ripple of amusement collapsed entirely into a silence with real fear underneath it. Because an emperor testing 9 centuries of doctrine in front of the assembled nobility was not a small risk. It was, potentially, the kind of accident that ends reigns. He walked into the fire anyway. There was no hesitation in it, no visible weighing of doctrine against impulse. He simply stepped over the low stone rim into flame that had burned unbroken for 900 years. And the court's collective gasp was the loudest sound the founding day rite had produced in living memory. Louder even than the ceremonial horns. Because every person present understood they were watching either a miracle or a death, and had no way yet to know which. It was, in the end, neither entirely a miracle nor entirely survivable without cost. And the truth sat somewhere honest between the 2 extremes the court had braced for. The old founding magic was real, in part, dragon scale, in a dragon emperor's true form, resisted the sacred flame in a way ordinary fire could never have matched. And Faelan did not die, did not even fall, moving through the blaze with the deliberate care of a creature testing ground it has never been permitted to test. But real was not the same as costless. The fire found the place's doctrine's protections were thinnest. The membrane at the wing joints, the tender scale along the throat where scale gives way to something softer. And by the time he emerged, Bouquet held with impossible delicacy between two claws built for considerably less careful work, smoke rising off his own scorched hide in visible curls. The cost of 9 centuries of untested doctrine was written plainly across him for the whole court to see. He crossed the court's stone floor in a silence so complete, Liora could hear her own heartbeat, and he knelt. An emperor, in dragon form, kneeling, which court protocol had no ceremony prepared for it all, and set the bouquet down at her feet with a gentleness that seemed, after what it had cost to retrieve, almost unbearable to witness. The flowers were singed at the edges. The ember bell blooms, closest to the flame's heart when they'd landed, had taken the worst of it, their gold throats blackened past saving. But the arrangement held its shape, held its 11 days of careful architecture, held— Liora understood this only much later, once she'd learned what the flowers meant. The one thing in the whole bouquet that could not be replaced. "You did not have to," she said, the first words she managed, kneeling to meet him at the stone floor with hands that would not quite stop shaking. It was flowers. It was only flowers. The great head, scorched and smoking, came down until the enormous eye was level with hers, and held there, and said without words, everything Faelan did not yet trust himself to say in front of 9 centuries of assembled doctrine. It was not only flowers. Let me take you back to those 3 mornings on the garden colonnade, before the rite, before the fire, because they matter more than the court ever knew. Faelan had first noticed her on an ordinary Tuesday, flying a low, restless circuit over the palace grounds the way he sometimes did when council business grew too dense to sit through without air. And the scent that had reached him from the garden below was not, at first, anything he could name. Something in the arrangement of it, the particular proportion of lily to iris to a smaller golden note he could not immediately place, snagged at a part of his memory that had gone quiet decades ago and did not appreciate being woken. He landed, unseen, in the shadow of the colonnade's far arch, and watched a young woman in a florist's apron work through a mountain of stems with a concentration so total she never once looked up to notice 40 feet of black scale settling into the garden's deep shade. She hummed while she worked, tunelessly, the way people do when they have forgotten anyone might be listening. And she muttered corrections to herself. No, too heavy on the left. The iris needs to breathe. With the specific, irritable tenderness of someone who loved the work too much to let it be less than right. He came back the second morning on purpose. By the third, he had stopped pretending to himself it was curiosity about the scent alone, and had started, uneasily, to recognize the shape of what was actually drawing him down into that shadowed arch 3 mornings running. Not the flowers, though the flowers were extraordinary. The utter unself-conscious honesty of a person who worked exactly as hard when no one of consequence was watching as she did when the whole court's eyes were on her. He did not introduce himself. Founding Day protocol forbade an emperor from approaching the ceremonial florist before the rite, a rule intended to preserve the arrangement's surprise and, not incidentally, the court's sense of occasion, and Faelan told himself he was simply respecting doctrine, and did not examine too closely why respecting doctrine felt, for the first time in years, like genuine reluctance rather than habit. It was only afterward, kneeling on the scorched stone with a rescued bouquet between them, 3 mornings of unadmitted watching finally catching up to him all at once, that he understood exactly how long he had already been paying attention, and how little of it had anything to do with Founding Day ceremony at all. There is one more piece of that first week worth telling, because it explains something about Liora that the court, focused entirely on the drama of the fire, never fully appreciated. On the evening after the rite, with her hands still healing from small burns collected pulling the singed ember bell free of the rest of the arrangement to save what could be saved, she sat up half the night in the workshop rebuilding the bouquet's damaged half from fresh stock. Not because anyone had asked her to, but because she could not bear to let Faelan's scorched effort be wasted on a half-ruined arrangement, when whole flowers were sitting in the cold room doing nothing. The master florist found her there past midnight, hands bandaged, working by a single lamp, and asked her, not unkindly, why she hadn't simply let it rest until morning. "He walked through fire for this," Liora said, not looking up from the stem she was setting. "The least I can do is make sure what's left of it is worth what it cost him." The master florist, who had trained apprentices for 30 years and thought he had long since stopped being surprised by any of them, went home that night and told his wife, with some wonder, that he suspected he had just watched the beginning of something the whole court was going to spend a great deal of time discussing. He was, as it turned out, entirely correct. The silence that followed lasted long enough that the court chronicler, writing the official record that evening, would struggle to render it in words at all, settling finally on a phrase that became, within the season, a common expression across 9 provinces. Silent as the founding fire. It was Odessa Rennick who broke it, though not by choice. The crowd's attention, drawn first by the miracle and then by the smoking cost of it, had begun, inevitably, to trace backward. Who had been standing nearest the bouquet, whose hand had been closest to the stem, whose voice had murmured about hedge cutters just before the flowers went into the flame, and Odessa found herself, within the space of perhaps 30 seconds, transformed from an anonymous member of a laughing crowd into its single, visible, unmistakable point of origin. The Dragon Emperor, still scorched, still kneeling at Liora's feet with the rescued bouquet between them, turned his great head toward the source of the court's collective, damning attention, and Odessa Rennick discovered, in that moment, precisely how much protection 4 generations of minor nobility purchased against the direct regard of an emperor who had just walked through 9 centuries of sacred fire for a florist's apprentice's flowers. "I will not ask who," Faelan said. And though the words came from a throat scorched by flame, they carried somehow, with perfect clarity across the whole silent court. "Because I find I already know, and because the punishment for cruelty dressed as jest is a matter for tomorrow's council, not today's right. Today I have only one thing to say to this court, and I will say it once, so that no one present will later claim they did not hear it plainly. The woman who built this bouquet has more honor in her hands than this entire court has managed to demonstrate in a single generation, and the next person who mistakes her birth for her worth will answer to me directly, without the courtesy of a council session first." The founding day rite concluded, that year, in a silence the palace scribes had never before been required to record, and Odessa Rennick spent the following season, by unanimous and unspoken agreement of the entire court, discovering exactly how thoroughly a hedge-cutter's daughter's honor could reshape a room once an emperor had spent his own scorched hide proving it. It was 3 days before Liora learned, from Faelan himself, exactly what she had built without knowing it, and the telling happened in the palace's private garden colonnade, the same vantage from which he had watched her working, unseen, for 3 mornings running. "The ember bell," he said, turning one of the salvaged blackened blooms carefully between 2 fingers that were, she noticed, still healing from the fire's cost. "You included it because the archive records say my grandmother favored it. That much you found in the records honestly, and I confess I did not expect any apprentice in 3 generations to dig deep enough to find it at all. But the records do not say why she favored it, because the reason was never written down. It could not be. It was not the kind of thing my grandmother trusted to ascribe." He was quiet a moment, turning the scorched bloom in the garden light. "Emberbell grows only near the old nesting grounds in the far north," he said. "My grandmother was hatched there. She left it, as dragons do, when she took the crown, and she never once in 60 years of reign returned. Some griefs for our kind are better carried at a distance than revisited. But she kept Emberbell in every arrangement she ever commissioned for the rest of her life, in every season, without explanation, and no one at court ever understood why, including, eventually, her own son. I did not understand it myself until I watched a florist's apprentice, entirely on the strength of old records and her own careful instinct, choose the same bloom for the same reason my grandmother never spoke aloud. Because home does not stop being home simply because you have left it, and some flowers are how the leaving gets carried anyway. Liora looked at the blackened bloom in his hand, and then at him, and understood, with the particular vertigo of realizing you have accidentally spoken a dead woman's private language fluently, exactly what she had built into 11 days of careful stem work without ever intending to. I chose it because the records said she favored it, she said. I did not know the rest. I could not have known the rest. No, Faelan agreed. And that is, I think, precisely why it mattered as much as it did. You did not build this bouquet to flatter me, or to prove yourself to a court that has spent 3 years underestimating you. You built it because the flowers themselves deserve the honesty of being chosen for the right reasons. That is a rarer thing at this court than you have perhaps been permitted to notice. The court, in the weeks that followed, learned to recalculate around Liora Vance with the swiftness institutions reserve for lessons taught expensively and in public. The master florist, who had quietly admired his apprentice's talent for years without ever having occasion to defend it so visibly, found himself fielding requests from noble houses who had, a month prior, barely acknowledged the girl's existence and now competed for her attention with an eagerness that would have been comic if it were not so transparently self-serving. Liora navigated it with the same steady competence she brought to every arrangement. Polite, unmoved, entirely unwilling to pretend that a court's sudden interest erased 3 years of its previous indifference. Faelan found reasons, with increasing frequency and decreasing subtlety, to visit the garden colonnade during her working hours. He was not, by his own cheerful admission, particularly good at courtship in the conventional sense. An emperor's whole life had trained him in ceremony and command, and neither served him well standing awkwardly among seedling trays trying to explain why he had, again, found time in a packed council schedule to watch a florist work. Liora, for her part, found she did not mind the awkwardness in the slightest. It was, she came to realize, the first attention she had received at court in 3 years that asked nothing of her except her actual presence. You could simply say you enjoy watching me work, she told him on one of these visits, not looking up from the stem she was trimming. It would save us both a great deal of manufactured business about garden inspections. I have counted, Majesty. This is the 11th time in a month you have found urgent cause to inspect a garden that has not changed its layout in a decade. I could, Faelan agreed, with the particular relief of a man given permission to stop pretending. I find I have been avoiding saying it plainly because plain things, once said, cannot be unsaid. And I have spent 900 years of doctrine discovering exactly what happens when I stop being careful about a threshold. I walked through founding fire for your flowers, Liora Vance. I am not entirely certain what is left, after that, for me to pretend I am not certain of. She set down her shears at that, finally, and looked at him properly. The way she looked at a finished arrangement when she was deciding whether it was truly done or merely close. Then stop pretending, she said. I have spent 3 years at this court being underestimated by people who never once bothered to look closely enough to be wrong about me. I find I have very little patience left for anyone else doing it, Majesty, Emperor, or otherwise. They were married the following spring, at the founding day rite itself, a deliberate choice on both their parts to return to the exact site of the cruelty and rebuild it into something the court would remember for entirely different reasons. Odessa Rennick, in the season between, had undertaken what the court chronicler described, with careful diplomatic restraint, as a period of significant personal reflection, and attended the wedding at the very back of the assembled nobility, in a silence that this time carried genuine humility rather than fear. Liora, asked afterward whether she forgave the woman, considered the question with her usual careful honesty and said only that forgiveness and forgetting were different things, and that she intended to practice the first without pretending at the second. The bouquet Liora built for her own wedding carried emberbell at its heart, deliberately, unapologetically. Not blackened this time, but whole. Gathered fresh from a small bed she had planted herself in the palace garden using seed scent, at Faelan's quiet request, from the old northern nesting grounds his grandmother had never returned to in 60 years of reign. It was, the court agreed, the most quietly radical act of the entire ceremony, a hedge-cutter's daughter planting, with her own hands, in the emperor's own garden. The flower and empire's whole doctrine of untouchable grief had kept unspoken for 2 generations. Song of Solomon says that many waters cannot quench love, neither can the floods drown it, and Liora thought of the line often in the years that followed, tending the emberbell bed that had, by then, spread well beyond its original planting, because she had watched, with her own eyes, exactly what it took to test that claim against something as literal and merciless as 9 centuries of sacred fire, and had found, at the heart of the flame, that the claim held. The scars from the founding fire never fully faded, along the throat, at the wing joints, pale seams in the black scale that the court, in time, stopped flinching from and started, quietly, admiring. Because every noble house in 9 provinces had by then heard the story of exactly what they cost and exactly what they were worth. Liora traced them sometimes. In the private hours, the ceremony of a throne still occasionally allowed them, and Faelan let her, the way he let very few people near the place's doctrine had once declared untouchable even to him. "You could have simply let the flowers burn," she told him once, tracing the pale seam at his throat with the same careful attention she gave a difficult stem. "No one would have blamed you. 9 centuries of doctrine would have forgiven you completely." 9 centuries of doctrine, Faelan said. Never once had to watch the specific fire in your face when you thought 11 days of your own 2 hands were about to be reduced to ash in front of a court that had spent 3 years telling you that was all your work deserved. "I did not walk into that fire for doctrine, Liora. I walked into it because I discovered, in the length of one held breath, that I would rather test 9 centuries of untested magic than watch that particular fire go out of your face for 1 moment longer than I had to. The founding day rite is different now, at the Jade Palace. In one small permanent way the scribes record, without fully explaining why. The ceremonial bouquet carried before the throne each year is required, by an amendment. Faelan pushed through his own reluctant council in the first year of his marriage, to include at least 1 bloom the arranging florist selected for a reason they were prepared to explain honestly, under direct questioning, to the emperor himself. No one has ever mistaken a flower for court decoration at the Jade Palace since. Some things, once walked through fire for, simply stop being small. Odessa Rennick, in the years that followed, became an unlikely footnote to her own cruelty. The woman whose small jest at another's expense had by pure accident of consequence produced the most celebrated founding day rite in 3 generations. She never fully lived it down at court, and to her credit, she never asked to. She sent, every founding day thereafter, a modest and unsigned contribution of rare stock to the palace gardens, river iris bulbs 1 year, a strain of northern lily the next. And Liora, who recognized the unmistakable hand behind the anonymous gifts within the first season, chose, quietly, and without ceremony, to plant every one of them. Forgiveness and forgetting were different things, she had told the court once. She had not said she was incapable of the first simply because the second remained permanently out of reach. The master florist retired 3 years into Liora's marriage, and the position he left behind went, by unanimous and entirely uncontested acclaim, to the hedge-cutter's daughter who had once needed a groundskeeper's recommendation and her own stubborn insistence to be let anywhere near the palace gardens at all. She trained her own apprentices the way she wished she had always been trained, judged on the honesty of their hands rather than the accident of their birth. And more than one future florist at the Jade Palace would grow up knowing the story of the founding fire, not as court gossip, but as the standard the whole trade was quietly, permanently held to afterward. And every founding day, without fail, the ceremonial bouquet carried before the throne holds, at its exact center, one bloom of emberbell, grown now from a bed that had spread, season by season, until it ringed the garden colonnade where a dragon had once watched, unseen, for 3 mornings running, and discovered that some things are worth walking through fire to keep from burning.